concern about the standalone funds. So how will we know in 4 years' time that we have actually delivered for women and girls? How will we measure the mainstreaming that is
Well, it's a couple of things. One, we are committed to an equality impact assessment, and of course in making the determinations that we have to make over the coming months, we will be looking both in the immediacy, that's 25, 26, to make sure that women and girls are not unduly affected, and then over the longer term allocation to make that assessment, and Baroness Chapman will lead on that. That's the first thing. The second thing, as I say, is to work with partners to do our very best to support women and girls. We cannot step in, obviously, in relation to the amount of money that's come out of the system with US funding particularly, but I do have to be clear that I do believe it is wrong for the poorest people in the world to be at the mercy of political decisions made in chambers in the West. And that is what African leaders say to me. And therefore, whilst I recognise that your concern is really women's rights and not losing pots of funding, in the current climate, we have also got to use our diplomatic efforts and all of our soft power to ensure that women and girls are centred. And that is what Harriet Harman's pretty articulate about how we work with women in elected positions in the countries in situ to help support other women.
Yeah. And just one final specific question. I can't really talk about women's rights without asking about Afghanistan and what is happening to women and girls there. There is a movement to push for gender apartheid to be recognised as a crime against humanity in a treaty that's being negotiated in the UN. What's the UK doing diplomatically to stand up for women and girls in Afghanistan, and is that something that the UK is looking at supporting?
One of the things that, and I spoke to Harriet Harman about this a few weeks ago, one of the things that we are doing is working with women, elected representatives who are women in Gulf countries particularly, to influence some of the decision making in situ in Afghanistan and to support those women. I was very pleased to go to Afghanistan when I was in opposition as opposition spokesman for foreign affairs. And of course, I still expect us to be delivering a lot of support, both multilaterally and, I suspect, well, actually, because we aren't present, it will largely be through the multilaterals. So I will do everything I can to centre those girls that I met and those women I met who were in the most desperate of positions. I will look at the
Gender apartheid.
The gender apartheid. I'm not familiar with it, but I will look at it.
I'll ask you a couple of specifics and write to us if you haven't got the data. The previous government set a target of 80% of FCDO programmes would include a focus on gender equality by 2030. Are you keeping to that commitment?
I'll have to write to you on that.
And the other one
but
is...
I suspect because we're doing a whole line-by-line review, that I cannot commit to decisions made by the last government. It's for us to look at this afresh.
You're going to give me the same answer if you could write to me at the same time. How much ODA will be allocated for specific programmes for women and girls?
Well, that will be in the line-by-line allocation that we're going through.
Because we've always found it very hard to pull that out.
The committee will go through that in detail. I know Baroness Chapman has been through that with you on a number of occasions, and so across a whole range of areas, this committee will want to scrutinise the detail of the decisions we make. Not women and girls is one, but I know that the committee will have other areas as well.
A big win for this committee a couple of years ago was getting the number of lines published from 4 up to 5, so we were very proud of that. So the detail that we get isn't that detailed, and we've always been unable to see specifically what money has been targeted at women and girls. So if there is a way in the future you could be more transparent, we would be very grateful for that, Foreign Secretary. And one other point, you were talking a lot about African leaders and elected women, and I know that what is Harriet Harman's title?
She's the envoy.
Envoy, thank you very much, for Women and Girls. She's very focused on elected women. But I wonder, can you give us a commitment that the voices of civil society and actual girls will be involved in decision making rather than those that are able to get into elected positions?
Of course. Of course. The whole thrust also of our response is to work locally, in country, and by definition that's working with the most vulnerable. But I think that if Harriet were here, she would defend her desire to work with elected women locally, in situ, not entirely to be governed by the views in a parliament like ours, or indeed in a government like ours. So I think both are right. It's not an either or.
Good. Thank you very much. Can I pass over to Monica, please?
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, if I could just pick up, you say that you are absolutely committed to development and that the poorest people in the world should not be at the mercy of political decisions. And yet your government has cut the aid budget by 40%, much further than any other government, in fact the lowest level for 50 years. Can you see how those two things don't add up?
Well, first, what I said was that leaders that I have met in the global south are saying they do not want to be at the whim of political decisions in places like Westminster that can turn development on, turn development off, and make political decisions about pots of funding. And the example was women and girls. That's what I said. I didn't say it was my view. I said it's what I'm hearing back. The second thing I said was that if you look since the development story began, which is really a post-war, end of empire story, that actually aid spending has often been relative to defence spending. I don't accept the premise that defence does not keep people safe, because it does. We do have to invest in defence at this time, and I don't think there's anybody in the committee that's going to disagree with that. We are not shrinking our ambition in the UK. We do want to get back to higher spend, but we will still be the biggest global spender. I made an announcement just 3 weeks ago of our commitment to Gavi. We are the biggest single donor to Gavi. That's not shrinking from ambition. That's stepping up when others are stepping back. But it is the case that we've got to look across the whole arsenal of what government can do. And for that reason, we do have to reduce spending. But overall, I would defend moving to a model where we're reliant on our technical skills. How can we harness the City of London on areas like climate finance? It is still the case that many of the countries to which the committee have gone to have not got sufficient health systems. How can we actually help people with the technical procedures to have their own health systems? I don't think the committee is in a place where it would be saying that Britain should be engaged in the 21st century in massive service delivery in country. We should be helping countries to service that. So reform is necessary, and I stand by the decision to reform. But yes, of course, it's sad that we weren't able, as the West, to do that a few years ago collectively.
Foreign Secretary, can I come to Sudan? Sudan, I don't need to, of course, remind you that it's the worst humanitarian crisis since aid began and there are war crimes being committed, it seems, as on almost a daily basis. Foreign Secretary, there's been one statement in 7 months from yourself on Sudan. Is the government treating this as a priority?
Well, in that statement in the House of Commons, I called out the fact that right across the Western world, there has been too little attention on Sudan. It was me that went to the UN and put down a resolution and almost got that resolution despite the Russian veto on Sudan. It was me that led a statement on Sudan. It was me that went to the Chad border on Sudan. It was me that called a London conference and brought colleagues together on Sudan. So as a foreign minister in a Western democracy, I think I have stepped up on Sudan, notwithstanding the fact that we have a war in Ukraine, we have a terrible conflict, of course, Israel-Gaza, we've had Israel-Iran, we've had India-Pakistan, we've got DRC, Rwanda, there are other conflicts. But I have lamented how little attention has been paid to conflict in Africa, of which Sudan is the worst humanitarian catastrophe on the planet, which is why when I went, I committed more money, but also why at the London conference that I called, I was pleased to get the global community committing, I think it was a further 800 million in financing to that terrible, terrible conflict, and we continue to keep on it because we need it to come to an end.
And thank you for your efforts, Foreign Secretary. Can I ask what momentum has happened since the London conference? Because the results of it were disappointing.
Well, I don't think you can describe the pledges that we got on the humanitarian side as disappointing in face of the hardship and in face of the question that I got previously on women and girls, when this is a conflict. I don't think there's any other conflict that affects quite as many women and girls as this. And I've met women raped, women burned, women terribly, terribly violated as a consequence of this conflict. We continue to work with partners to try and ease that suffering. There remain questions about aid and UN presence in country, in Sudan. And of course there remain real issues in relation to the range of partners who are involved in this conflict and how we work with them to reduce particularly the amount of weapons that are finding their way to the various sides and the groups that are fighting.
Foreign Secretary, I had an exchange last week on the Business and Trade Select Committee with the Trade Minister about export licences and arms licences, particularly in regard to the UAE. Since Sudan's war has broken out in 2023, the New York Times has repeatedly reported on the UAE arming the RSF, including funneling arms through field hospitals. And the UN panel of experts in Sudan reported to the Security Council on these allegations and found them to be credible. Given the FCDO is the DPT's key partner in reviewing arms licences, what would he make of these allegations?
Well, we continue across a range of partners. And in London, we had countries that are neighbouring Sudan, other countries in the Gulf who were also had some relationship with the conflict, and we continue to emphasise the importance of refraining from actions that prolong the conflict. Of course, we do that. And a range of countries are able to use their levers to attempt to bring the parties to the negotiation table. And of course, I continue to press them to do that.
So does it trouble you, these reports, of which at the moment we're negotiating, or the government is negotiating a trade agreement?
Every aspect of the conflict in Sudan troubles me greatly.
So do you believe that the trade agreement should have, and the GCC should have, a human rights chapter attached to it? And if the human rights chapter in trade agreements, where is that driven from? Is that from the Department for Trade or from the FCDO?
Well, the United Kingdom is in a unique position to be able to deal with a range of partners, and I want to protect that position. And because that is how we were able almost to get a UN resolution. And I'd like to be able to work with other partners to get that UN resolution that protects people. And therefore, I'm not going to be in the position of name-calling any particular country. I will work with all countries to minimise the violence that's taking place.
Can I turn to the humanitarian efforts and the emergency response rooms in Sudan? I know that they have been very effective. Can you talk me through how the FCDO works in supporting them at the same time as multilateral agencies that are working in the field?
The effort in Sudan is largely being led by multilaterals because of the difficulty of working in the country. So it is a multilateral effort. I spoke to Tom Fletcher, I think it was 5 days ago. Obviously we discussed Israel-Gaza, but we also discussed our concerns about Sudan. He has been leaning in very heavily on Sudan to make sure that the aid is getting to the places where they need to get to. It would be good if we got safe zones, but we haven't achieved that at this point in time. But it is a multilateral effort, it is not a bilateral one. That would be impossible in this situation.
And finally, Foreign Secretary, can you tell me about the conversations that you're having with other regional actors since the conference on driving the diplomacy forward so that we can see an end to the war?
Yes, I spoke to the President of Angola, I spoke to President Ruto and the Kenyan Foreign Secretary. We believe it's important that we embolden the AU at this time, and that's why I brought them to the conference. And I have spoke to a range of Gulf partners about the conflict in Sudan, all of that since the conference, and there will be more, particularly as we head to UNGA in September.
Have you been able to speak to the UAE, to Egypt and to the Saudis on this particular issue?
Yes, I have.
Since the conference?
All three of those countries since the conference.
Foreign Secretary, thinking specifically about Sudan, a couple of comments, please. To reach a resolution and a lasting resolution, civil society has to be empowered. And I'm was a big fan of the CSSF fund, now the Integrated Security Fund, which was, I think, instrumental in empowering civil society to hold their leaders to account. I'm concerned that that fund is being sort of reduced and limited. Can you tell us anything, let's hope, post-conflict about how you're working with the international community to empower civil society?
I think it is important that obviously we do everything we can to shore up civil society, and given the challenges around aid and given the challenges around aid workers working in Sudan, we should remember that there are civil society organisations on the ground that we have to support, carrying much of the load at this time. I am reflecting on the integrated fund at this moment, so I can't give you an update, but I will seek either through the Development Minister or myself to come back to you on that.
I would appreciate that, and also sort of part of that lasting peace is holding perpetrators to account. Do you think the as it currently stands, or in the near future, Sudan has the judicial capability to hold those committing attacks, specifically on aid workers, to account?
I know that some UK funding is also supporting accountability and transparency in country. It's a big country, there are atrocities happening all over, and of course we haven't talked about issues in South Sudan either, but I do know that we are contributing to that effort.
Okay, and I speak to you as a lawyer as well as the Foreign Secretary.
I haven't been a lawyer for 27 years.
A lawyer, a politician, a writer and a Foreign Secretary, bringing all of those together. Do you see that the UK could have some role in drawing the international community together to make sure that the international courts have the power, the influence and the resources to hold breaches of international humanitarian law, civil breaches when it comes to conflict to account?
At this stage, my focus has been on convening to, one, support the humanitarian effort, and to, two, to try and broker a better political situation than we have at present, and that's what the London conference was about. And I've indicated that there's more to do. You're right to press on the most egregious atrocities being committed
It's
at
horrific.
this time and accountability for those atrocities. And you're right, absolutely, to press on the lack of resources that you would expect that Sudan haven't got. I will take that away and I will look at that more closely. And of course, there are partners in Europe, the Netherlands, the Norwegians, that have traditionally been very present in that area that we may be able to work more with.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Can I pass over to Tracy?
Hi, Foreign Secretary. Moving on to Gaza, with another 20 civilians killed today, how are you working with international partners to improve aid access in Gaza and to end the violence at the distribution centres?
Is this a good point to refer you? I hesitate because I'm not sure the chairs, but it's just that this is a moving situation. It's abominable, frankly, let's be clear. And so I thought, let's look at the up-to-date picture.
Treading into that territory, so tread lightly.
Well, I tread lightly, but you'll see in slide 1 that and this is pertinent to the committee's work, that Palestinian civilians have been pushed into less than 15% currently of the territory in the Gaza Strip, and that's the white areas on the map which demonstrate that. At this point in time, almost 2.1 million people have been displaced, now multiple times, and that effectively the new aid system has 4 distribution points, when we think there should be 400 distribution points, and that horrendously and unbelievably we have children queuing for food at those distribution points and being killed. It's hard to describe that as anything other than unconscionable. At the same time, we have trucks waiting at borders. There were some food programme trucks able to get in a few days ago, and I know that Kaja Kallas and the European Union have brokered a deal for more trucks to go in, but the advice I received as of yesterday was that no extra trucks have gone in. Now, what we have been able to do is get our medical aid in, and you know we've given a lot to UK Med particularly, to support people on the ground. But the situation is dire. It continues to be dire. That's why we continue to press for a ceasefire, and we continue to press for unfettered aid to get in.
Can I ask you, how certain are you that no UK bombs and bullets are injuring aid workers and civilians while they're queuing for aid?
I'm very certain. And I'm very certain because I took the decision to suspend arms sales to Gaza back in September. That is a decision that is reviewed by me every 2 months. The instruction then goes to the Business and Trade Secretary, and we are not sending arms to Israel.
Foreign Secretary, can I ask, what is your response to the Israeli Defence Minister's recent proposal for a humanitarian city?
Well, I condemn
in Rafah, and the language
I
that is used
condemn
around
them,
that?
and I note that Yair Lapid, former leader Olmert, also condemned them in the strongest of terms. And it's my understanding that Prime Minister Netanyahu also disassociated himself from them on returning from Washington a few days ago. But no defence minister should be talking about effectively holding people unable to leave, presumably, in the manner in which you described, and I condemn them in the strongest terms.
Gaza is a slightly bigger version of what he's proposing. Gaza is a slightly bigger version of what he's proposing. People can't.
Well, that's why I thought that this map would be
withheld.
helpful, because if you are effectively holding people in 15% of the territory,
Exactly.
They've been displaced many times. Sewage, sanitation, medical situation, starvation and malnutrition is rampant, then I think that that's unconscionable. And I think that the global community are looking at Israel and they are saying to the government, how could you possibly allow this to happen? And I support members of our own public who are calling this out, and we continue to call this out. That's why the Prime Minister led a leader's statement. I led a Foreign Secretary statement a few weeks ago. We had 27 countries that supported it to get the aid back in. All of us were hoping for a ceasefire at this point, and I think we're hugely disappointed that we had not achieved it. Aid remains an issue. The duration of the ceasefire remains an issue. And relocation of Israeli forces during the ceasefire is also an issue between the Israeli government and Hamas at this time that has not led us to a place where we've got that ceasefire.
Foreign Secretary, as you said, you've been a politician for 26 years. You're politically one of the most powerful people in this country. I think your reputation internationally is strong, so you're internationally you're a very powerful person. And I just wonder, so I sit here chairing this committee, hearing the evidence firsthand. The committee's been as close as we can get to take first-hand testimony, and I feel utterly useless when it comes to this. And I just wonder, how do you feel? And is there anything else that you wish that you could do that's within your power that you're not doing right now? And how do we get to a point where this slaughter stops?
I think that I've been in power or in the government a year. There hasn't been a day in which I haven't in some shape or form reformed to this most horrendous of conflicts. And of course I wish, as the country's chief diplomat, that we had a ceasefire that I have been calling for well over a year. All I can stand by is my record and the Prime Minister's record on this most horrendous of conflicts. When we came into office, there was no funding going to UNRWA. We restored that funding. When we came into office, there was no suspension of arms. When we came into office, and sadly it still continues to this day, beyond Gaza there was horrendous settler violence. We have sanctioned those. There have been horrendous statements in relation to that by Ministers Smodrick and Ben Conveer. We have sanctioned them. We have increased aid to the occupied territories at this time, and I have visited on numerous occasions. We've signed a memorandum of understanding with the Palestinian Authority. Prime Minister Mustafa was in my office discussing these issues and sat with the Prime Minister in number 10 looking at these issues. We continue to support the Palestinian Authority on their reform agenda. Our most senior individual, probably of the last 25 years on delivery, Michael Barber, is working hand in hand with them. But have we brought this conflict to an end? It saddens me greatly that we have not, as an international community, been able to bring this conflict to an end. And does it make me, I'm getting emotional talking to you, as the father of 3 children, looking at the images that all of us see on our social media of children maimed and killed, Of course it affects me. I'm a human being. But in the end, it is the work diplomatically, to try and bring this conflict to an end that I have to be part of. Can the UK do that unilaterally? No, we cannot. Have we got to do that with partners? Yes, we can. And we continue to lead and work with partners, as you saw a few weeks ago. But is it desperately frustrating? Of course it's frustrating. Is it unconscionable? Yes, it's unconscionable. Is it an abomination? Of course it's an abomination. The ceasefire needs to happen. The aid needs to get in. The hostages need to get out. We have been saying that time after time after time. And it's reprehensible, some of the language that we're seeing from senior politicians in Israel, like Minister Katz.
Thank you. I've got Monica, then Tracy. You want to come back on this? Then Sam, then Tracy, then James on this particular point.
Foreign Secretary, you made the point that I was going to make, that the public are watching and they want the British government to do something, and I appreciate what's been done already, but they want you to do more. Now, there are things you could do. You've sanctioned Ben Gvir and Smotrich. You could sanction Katz, who's advocated for the aid blockade and for the 20 new settlements in the APT. It is not true to say that UK weapons are not going into Israel. Components of F-35s are. So at what point do we stop that? And when are you going to recognise a Palestinian state? There is more that can be done.
On your first point, you know that I can't comment on sanctions that are under consideration, but you have heard my statements about what has been said by Minister Katz, and you will have heard my statements previously about Ministers Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and then the subsequent decision that I took. That's the first issue. On the issue of recognition, this is an important issue. We believe in this country, and I think it's a cross-party position, to stand up for two states. The Palestinian cause is a just cause, and it is important that we recognise. The question is when and how, and of course I recognise that that's a subject of debate and discussion, and we are working, of course, with our French and Saudi Arabian partners. They were going to have a conference. It did not take place because of the 12-day war with Iran. That conference, I understand, is to be reconvened on the 28th of July, but it's not yet at the leaders' level, and they're indicating that will be delayed in September. But of course we continue to work with them. Ms. Harding, I suspect that you stand by the work that our country has to do in relation to conflict in other theatres in the world. I suspect you would not want us to send direct parts for F-35s to Israel, and we are not doing that. But I also think that you would not want us to not participate in the supply pool to the whole F-35 programme across the world. There are partners, particularly in Europe, that we would not want to undermine, and it's for that reason that we made that decision, and I'm pleased that that was upheld by the courts just a few weeks ago.
Four questions.
You mentioned the children of Gaza a moment ago, and recently I, along with some other MPs, met with a British plastic surgeon who just returned from there. He showed us video footage and images that I'm afraid I will never forget of the suffering of Gaza's children. As you know, tens of thousands are orphans, and many of them are dying because they're not able to receive medical treatment. To date, just 2 children have entered the UK for medical treatment. And I understand that there are complexities around this, but I know that I would be happy to take a Palestinian child into my home. I'd be happy to help fund their treatment, but we're not able to without the power of the state behind it. Is there not more that we can do for the children of Gaza?
Well, we have supported the Hope charity and initiative to bring children to the UK. I am happy to do more if those requests come in, and the UK is obviously doing a tremendous amount in situ with UK Med. There have been 500,000 consultations delivered as a result of British taxpayers in situ since January 2024. You'll remember there was the most horrendous outbreak of polio, and we sponsored the polio vaccination scheme again in country, and we've helped just under 500,000 people to receive essential healthcare in country. I don't want to suggest that with hospitals bombed and lots of aid not able to get in, that people aren't experiencing real medical emergency second by second, minute by minute in Gaza. But we are doing a lot in the medical space, particularly, and will continue to. And if there are more children that we can work with Hope and others to bring in, of course we will do that.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Just reflecting on some of the things that you were saying, I don't think any of us would doubt your passion to try and resolve these issues. We went up to Scotland just the day actually that foreign aid changes were announced, and we met a Palestinian aid worker up there employed by Oxfam. And she told us that when it came to FCDO diplomacy, lots of warm words, lots of hard-working people, but she felt like the FCDO has lost its confidence and lost its clout in light of Afghanistan and I guess the legacy of Iraq and Brexit. Is that a view that you would recognise?
Well, I think that in the last year I've been on the business of reform. We've got a workforce programme to 2030 to give us the best capabilities. I've listed the things that we've tried to deliver in relation to Israel-Gaza. We've had a successful EU summit. Tomorrow we have further good news with our partnership with Germany. Last week we had good news with our partnership with France. Our partnership with Ireland has been renewed. By the way, we want to do more with Ireland on the development. They're a great development nation and we can partner with them in areas to support work together. We've launched the Africa approach. So yes, after the botched merger between DFID and the old Foreign Office, after Brexit, after Afghanistan, it's a matter of record that morale was low within the Foreign Office. But it's my job to get the Foreign Office and development back to a good place. I think we've had a good year where if you look back on where we were, we've delivered a lot. And I said, judge me by the deals and the partnerships that we could strike with other nations. And I think that's what I've set about doing.
I was disappointed that when I think it was 300 civil servants wrote to you about their concerns that not enough was being done in Gaza and the West Bank by FCDO, that rather than seeing them as whistleblowers, they were seen as disloyal. Why did that happen?
Well, the first thing is, it goes back to the question that was raised by Ms Harding. When pushed on what more could the UK do, the truth is we've done a lot
No
that we
one's
stand by.
disputing
That's
that.
the first thing. And my record in office on this file is considerable. And I've just gone through that list.
No, it's...
The second thing is to say that, and the reply was appropriately not by me, because the custodianship of the staff is ultimately a matter for the Perm Sec. And it may be that our second Perm Sec wants to come in on this point. But Ollie Robbins was clear that of course staff must express opinion and must make their views known. But in the end, when you become a civil servant, your job is to be neutral. That is your job. And just as if I'm not happy about collective responsibility, my option is to resign, then that is also, civil servants will also be able to make that. So it cannot be about campaigning letters if you are a member of Her Majesty's government. That is not the principal job of our civil servants. It's to give us honest advice, and it's then for politicians to assess and make decisions on the basis of that advice. I stand by the advice I've made on this file. There's been little challenge to that, frankly, because I think the committee recognises the part that the UK is playing. We haven't brought the conflict to an end. Writing a letter, a campaigning letter, is not usually the disposition of civil servants. Of course they're frustrated. Many of our constituents are frustrated, and you write to your MP. But I stand by the decision that was made by the Perm Sec and the reply that he gave, which I thought was a very thorough and a very good one.
Is it on this point? Back to Tracy.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, just want to press you a little bit further. We hear a lot from aid workers and from civilians and groups from Gaza and occupied territories and across Israeli and Palestinian groups and NGOs about the recognition of Palestinian state and the lack of leadership from the UK and how that void could be filled by pushing ahead with the recognition. And I heard what you said to Monica. Can you tell us a bit more detail about when will be the right time, because we're all very concerned, as you are, as our constituents are, about there being no Gaza left by the time we come to recognise the Palestinian state. We see that from the map and the evidence that you've given us. So when will those conditions be right?
What the Labour Party said in our manifesto was that we do believe that recognition is important, and we would like to recognise as part of a process. That is the.
Makes it sound conditional,
Sorry?
That makes it sound conditional.
Well, it's the manifesto that you ran on at the last election.
Yeah. It was, so we'd shifted at one point to, it was part of a peace process, but,
well,
and that's been dropped, I believe. So I think what my colleagues tried to find out is what are the conditions.
Let me finish the point. That was the manifesto that all Labour politicians ran on just a year ago. So the debate is this: do you just recognise per se, because you say that the time to recognise has come and the symbolic act of recognising is where we're at, and I suspect, Ms Gilbert, that that's where you are at from what you have said, and I suspect that that's where Ms Harding is at and where the chair is at, that you recognise symbolically, and you accept that even though there are countries in the last year that did that, it has not changed the situation on the ground? Or do you recognise as part of a process? The French have been talking about a process, or trying to get some kind of process, and actually, if we get a ceasefire, you are into a process. But we haven't got a process at the moment. So that is the debate that's going on. And you will appreciate that when we're talking about the UK, we're talking about a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That's why we are in close dialogue with our partners in France. And of course we would like to have a process, because we would like actually to change the situation on the ground and tip it further towards two states. But I recognise that there are some who believe beyond the process the time has come. But I do say to you that recognition per se is not two states, and I actually want to see two states. For me, it's not a symbolic thing, it's about getting to two states and living by the 1967 and the Oslo Accords and achieving that. So that is the debate. It's a legitimate debate. And there are people on either side of that.
Just for the record, it's not for me about symbolism, it's about hope for the Palestinian people and what they have told us when I was on a visit to Israel and Palestine, and it's about leadership from the UK. So for me, it's not about symbolism. I absolutely accept the point that you make, and for decades prior to being in this place, I've also campaigned for a two-state solution. But I think there is more that the UK could do, and I hear your point about diplomacy and what that looks like, but if you if we cannot get to a point where the Israeli government are willing to have that discussion and have that ceasefire, then how do we push that process forward from a UK perspective?
Well, let me be clear, no country has a veto on our decision. It's our decision as to when to recognise and how to recognise. But I'm simply making the point that the act of recognition does not get you 2 states. It is a symbolic act. Of course, I recognise that it gives Palestinian people hope amidst the terrible, terrible hardship that they're experiencing, both in the West Bank and in terms of Gaza. But I'm sharing with you the diplomatic discussion that rightly we have with partners like France, but also countries like Saudi Arabia and the Jordanians and others, and the Palestinian Authority in relation to when and how, principally because we have wanted to effect change on the ground and tip the balance towards 2 states. And of course, don't forget that this conference, it was a Saudi-French initiative. It's not at this stage a leaders' conference. That moment has not happened because they too are calculating when best to tip this towards actually getting 2 states.
You say it's symbolic as though that's a negative thing, Foreign Secretary. I would say the UK recognising Palestine as a state would have a big implication internationally for other countries' determination of how they define, see, recognise and put legal weight around Palestine. Could I ask you on a separate point though, just to be minded that we're scrutinising you as a committee, not as individual MPs, and definitely not on our political backgrounds. So we also have collective responsibility as a committee, so singling out politicians for their manifestos is not that helpful in our duty, if that's okay, Foreign Secretary.
I recognise that you're saying on the committee, but I also recognise you're a group of politicians. I've been in this House for 25 years. You run on a manifesto. It's legitimate for me to remind you the manifesto you run on and why that was the position. You may not like it, but that's the envelope.
I have no
sorry.
I have no issue with you saying Labour politicians have run on a manifesto. It's when you are singling out and making comments about individual members that, as chair, I have an issue with that. If you could be respectful that we have collective responsibility.
Committee chair, I've served on committees. I am being respectful. I am simply referring to committee members by their name. Your names are all around you. I'm being polite.
That's great.
I'm sorry you don't like it, but that's how I've
I
chosen to.
have no issue whatsoever with you using our names, but on our names it doesn't say our political parties. So if you could direct to the committee, that would be great, or an answer to their question, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, you've made the point, and
Thank you very
I've
much.
made my reply. Thank you.
Thank you. James, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. The committee recently published its report on international humanitarian law, protection, not permission. I wondered, has the Foreign Secretary had found time, appreciate very busy, found time to look at that report at all?
I haven't found time to look at that.
So what the report notes is that when it comes to international humanitarian law, there appears to be a trend where there is levels of trade-off. So you will have one country or one party that is seen to justify breaking international humanitarian law themselves because there has potentially been the previous party has broken that international humanitarian law as well. In other words, it's becoming a bit of a race to the bottom. I just wondered whether the Foreign Secretary recognised that description and wondered what exactly the UK is doing to make sure that international humanitarian law is held to the highest of standards.
Well, there is a race to the bottom. When aid workers are being killed in the numbers that we're seeing, there's a race to the bottom. When children are being killed holding out their hand for food, there's a race to the bottom. I took the sober decision on the basis of our export licensing regime that I did believe that there was a clear risk that international humanitarian law was being broken in the context of the conflict in Israel-Gaza. And of course it's the case. We haven't talked so far about the conflict in Ukraine. But of course it's the case that big countries decide that they're entitled to march into smaller countries, that is a gross breach of international humanitarian law, and that it's also the case that it sends a signal to other countries that they might do that. So, for example, Venezuela decide that they should march into Guyana and take over the Essequibo. So I recognise and totally would agree with the sentiments of the committee in relation to international humanitarian law. I think that it is also the case in Geneva and in New York, in terms of our ambassadors there and the work that we are doing across the multilateral system, that we are doing everything we can to stand by that international humanitarian law architecture, to stand up for the rules-based order, but I recognise that we're doing that in a very challenging environment. And there are other UN Security Council members who take a different view.
And there was the 3 British people that were killed in the airstrike on the World Central Kitchen aid convoy in April 2024. What progress do you think has been made within the region through diplomatic efforts when it comes to humanitarian aid workers' protection?
Not sufficient. I met with those families. I have called on the Israelis to properly investigate. I've called on the Advocate General to do the job that I think he should now do in relation to that terrible, terrible act that killed 3 British nationals. Further aid workers have been killed since then, and some of them within the last few weeks. So the situation is horrendous.
And progress? Do you feel like we are making progress diplomatically at all?
Well, clearly, if more aid workers have died, we are not making the progress collectively as an international community that I would like us to be making in relation to those gross breaches.
Okay. And on the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion, so that was July 2024, so 12 months now, I think a lot of people are wondering why the government has taken so long to respond to that advisory opinion. Would you be able to elaborate on that further 12 months on?
It's an 83 page opinion, so it's right that the lawyers that you would expect within government assist and do the work that you would expect them to do. What I would say about that opinion is that we agree that settlements are illegal. We agree that Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activity. I have condemned time and time again both the violence and the massive expansion that we've seen in the last year. We fund and support organisations on the ground, by the way, in relation to transparently helping us understand the nature of that expansion. We agree that we must distinguish in everything we do between Israel within the 1967 borders and illegal settlements in what is now the occupied Palestinian territories. We agree that Israel should bring an end to its presence in the occupied Palestinian territories as rapidly as possible, and we agree that when it's happening in the West Bank, it's completely unacceptable.
Foreign Secretary, can I just push you a little bit more on that? You agree that all of those things are unacceptable, but the Geneva Convention requires states, I quote, to respect and to ensure respect for IHL. However, contrary to the views of the ICRC, the government argues that this does not require the UK to ensure respect for IHL by other states, which would seem to go against what the Geneva Convention is saying. So I wonder, do you know, or could you write to us about why what the legal basis is for this position?
I can certainly take advice and write to you.
That would be very helpful. And sort of following on from that, where there's a serious risk of genocide, the UK is required to employ all means and do all in its power to prevent it as far as possible. So do you think that the government is doing everything within its power to prevent genocide in Gaza?
Genocide is the most egregious of war crimes. And so, of course, I believe we are doing all in our power to prevent any act of genocide anywhere in the world. Absolutely.
Thank you. Monica. And then Alice.
Foreign Secretary, you talked about core funding going to organisations on the ground that are trying to help with the upholding of international humanitarian law. So the UK gives money to the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission, which Poland asked to look at the attacks on the World Central Kitchen, but Britain didn't. And I'm just interested in why we didn't, because Poland did so in a way in which to restore an attitude of respect to IHL. So that's a very specific question. On a broader question, our commitment to the principles of IHL and the humanitarian principles, particularly in the distribution of aid, humanity, impartiality, neutrality and independence, are obviously not being upheld with GHF. Now, for us to claim a commitment to these principles, or for the government to claim a commitment to these principles, there have to be consequential action if those are violated. So my question to you is, what consequential action can we take for these violations of humanitarian law in whichever country, Sudan or Israel? And can I just finish? Sorry, just one last point. And this comes back to your point about recognition of a Palestinian state. And you talked about other countries and nothing happened. Britain is not other countries. We have a really, really key role, as you know, and as you have been proud of and said in the past. We have a key role on the world stage in our upholding of international humanitarian law and our commitment to democracy and democratic principles. Surely we can do more.
What more would you like?
I've already laid out what we could do in Israel. That's only some of this. But my question is to you, Foreign Secretary. What do you think we should do? Well, otherwise, as you said, it's a race to the bottom.
I do think the Foreign Secretary has answered that. But if you want to come back with more, Foreign Secretary.
Well, that's the point. I listed all the things that we have done. I think the implication of your question is that it's not sufficient. I think the implication of your question is you'd like us to recognise. I think we had a lengthy debate about recognition. And there are clearly views around the table, and you've expressed yours. Ms Gilbert has expressed hers. I've explained the balance that we are weighing. I've sensed some frustration from some members, including the committee chair, in relation to that. But I'm not sure, that's why I put it back to you, what more, other than that, would you like us to do? Because I am certainly satisfied that we've met our obligations under international humanitarian law. I'm not satisfied, and I have said that in the strongest terms, with the behaviour of the Israeli government in relation to aid, in relation to the treatment of prisoners, and in relation to expansion and violence on the West Bank particularly. I have also conveyed that and taken action in relation to that.
Sorry, Alice.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask specifically about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, linking the last two questions that we have. Obviously, reports that hundreds of people have been killed trying to access aid, and including recently aid workers as well. I know you have said at other committees that you, of course, don't support the approach of the foundation, but can you tell us more about how we've been raising those concerns with both the Americans and the Israeli government? And also, are you concerned that it will set a precedent for how aid could be delivered in other contexts, for example in Sudan, if it becomes semi-militarised? So 2 questions on the specifics and wider implications about what that model might mean for the future.
Well, in a way, this goes to slide 2 that is in front of you. And what that infographic shows is that there are 443,000 pallets of aid at the borders. Shelter, medicine, water, sanitation items. Over 136,000 pallets are still in Egypt. More than 130,000 pallets in Jordan. In excess of 120,000 pallets in Ashdod, and a further 505,000 pallets in the West Bank. Nearly 3,000 trucks waiting for dispatch. We are in disagreement with the Israeli governments about why those trucks are still waiting at borders. And we believe that those trucks should have gone in, and we believe in the last ceasefire we saw the sorts of volumes that are required in relation to aid and distribution. We disagree with the new system, which is why we continue to support the UN system and why I spoke to Tom Fletcher once again to give him my support this week. We have got medical aid getting in as the UK, but the issue around malnourishment and starvation is reprehensible, as I have said, and we are in disagreement. And I raised this issue with the Israeli Foreign Minister again just a few days ago.
And are you worried it might set a precedent for the future?
Well, it mustn't set a precedent.
Yeah.
It must not set a precedent. This is outwith of global norms and rules that we all signed up to after the Second World War. And that's why this is so egregious and so unconscionable.
It is a staggering situation that we're in, Foreign Secretary. Are you in negotiations with the Trade Secretary of State about potential further trade sanctions that we could do? Because I don't know what is going to stop these Israeli actions, and is trade sanctions on the table?
Well, I said that we said in the statement that we co-authored, the leader's statement and the statement around aid with foreign ministers, that we would continue to look at further actions. And so, yes, I continue to look at further actions in this area to do everything we can to press towards better aid distribution, less violence and no expansion in the West Bank, and I will do all that I can continue to do. I had hoped, I have to say, that by now we would have a ceasefire. And we haven't got a ceasefire.
I agree.
And I am very conscious that parliamentarians are going into recess in lots of Western democracies. So this is a time for acute vigilance as to what is happening.
Here, here. James, you done? David Taylor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Turning to Syria now, there's a bit better news there in the sense that we've seen the fall of a brutal dictator, much joy amongst people in this country, including our vibrant Syrian community. But of course, many, many challenges, as you know, not least the ongoing worries around sectarian violence flaring up in different places, and also the fact that 90% of the country are in poverty. I wondered if you could talk us through some of the steps that you've been taking, the visit that you did recently, how you're pushing for an inclusive government going forward, the work you've been doing around sanction reform, and also the humanitarian aid or the development aid situation there in terms of UK ODA in a context where, of course, the priority is Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine. Like what more can we be doing to support the Syrian people going forward?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Well, I was very privileged to visit Damascus on the 5th of July and to be the first Foreign Secretary to visit after 14 years in the country. The poverty line, and that 90% of Syrians are living below the poverty lines, did strike me. And the desperate state of the Syrian economy was also very striking. I spent time with civil society and NGOs when I was in Syria, not just meeting al-Shara and the Syrian government, and I do believe that it's hugely important, and I pressed al-Shara on this, that there has to be an inclusive political transition. There has to be accountability and a path to justice for victims of the Assad regime. And civil society did feel, and it would be, I have to make that clear, they did put to me concerns about that inclusive nature and about the nature of that accountability, which I had put to al-Shara. We are, of course, wanting to support the Syrian economy and the Syrian people at this time, wanting to encourage the government towards greater inclusivity. So I was very pleased to be there. But episodes of brutal violence involving Alawite and Druze communities are very, very concerning. and we will be redoubling our efforts, so working alongside other partners. And I spoke to the United States about this very recently. Supporting Syria in their counter-terrorism efforts at this time is also very, very important, because safety is something I left concerned about.
Thank you. And can I ask, just to follow up on that, a concern that some Syrians in the UK wanted me to raise, which is ultimately more of a matter for the Home Office, but I wondered if you had a view, is that there has been the news that we're going to stop pausing asylum claims, which is very welcome. Germany has offered people who don't yet have their status settled the opportunity to go back to Syria to visit family, to help with efforts to rebuild the country without removing their right to return back to Germany if they feel like they can't build themselves a future. Is that something that the UK can potentially look at for those that, you know, even though the pause has been lifted, there's going to be a number of Syrians in the UK who are still going to be waiting many months to get a final decision? In that period, could they be offered the opportunity to go back to visit Syria, to visit loved ones, to help rebuild, but not have their sort of right to return to the UK removed? Is that something the government could look at?
Well, what I saw from meeting with the President, the Foreign Minister and his team is a desire for peace, a desire for stability, and he made the commitment to me to remain to be inclusive. So I stand by the decisions that have been made by the Home Secretary in relation to those claiming asylum from Syria. I think that is the right thing to do. I'm not familiar with the German decision, but that may be in relation to those who are not in the asylum system but have actually got German citizenship, which is slightly different. But I do think the right assessment has been made at this time by the Home Office, but of course we've got to keep it under review because it's a very fragile situation.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. No.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Who is it, do you think, that loses out most from the UK's ODA cuts?
In what sense?
Distributionally. We are taking a huge sum of money that was, and it will no longer be. So who are the losers in that distribution?
We will still be the sixth biggest spender in development. That's the first thing. And the second thing is I've said that there will be an equality impact assessment done, and that is what will tell me those that might be affected, and of course I can act on the back of that.
And do you have any early concerns around that's stemming out of that work? Around particular groups, women and girls, for example, particular countries, anything that's leapt out at you so far in that work?
Well, we are committed to the multilateral system, so there will be decisions made bilaterally where we will be withdrawing. But I do think it's important when we think about development to recognise that what we can do at this time is also grow the amount of technical skills we're supporting countries with. We want to play a big role on the multinationals on which we're on the board. We can do a lot around finance, particularly. So there's lots of ways that we can continue to play a role, and we've got to be better coordinated across the Western family at a time when I listed the countries who are also making changes to their development aid. So we've got to work together with others so that we're each playing a part, but we will still be the sixth biggest spender, so we will have a significant role to play.
Foreign Secretary, I was with representatives from the British Virgin Islands yesterday, and this committee did a report into small island developing states, and we keep a keen interest on them and also our overseas territories as a whole. One of the frustrations that they have is, whilst they know the answers to the problems that they're facing, They don't have a platform like the UK does on the World Bank, for example, on one of the, you mentioned a lot of the big multilateral organisations. Is there discussions that are ongoing that the UK could, whilst not give up our seat, maybe give a platform more to some of these countries? Canada does it very well. I wonder if that's a way that we could use our influence that doesn't have cost to share power that we have the privilege of having with some of the countries that we look to support.
Well, we obviously do a lot with small island developing states. They are the lion's share, in fact, of the Commonwealth.
100%.
And we have sought to be alongside them, particularly on their big concerns about climate finance. It was why I met with my good friend Mia Motley. She's also been here in London particularly, but I also recall work in this area when I went to Chogam in Samoa. That's a very interesting suggestion, and I will look at it.
Thank you. I would say advocating is something we should continue doing, but actually giving over the platform on some occasions is a very, very powerful statement. Over to Sam.
Can I just ask a question, actually picking up on Noah's? And Foreign Secretary, I also stood on a manifesto that didn't commit to cutting aid, by the way. And one of the things that I think the British taxpayer probably wants to know is what is the human impact of it in terms of how many minefields won't be cleared, in terms of what will be the spread of infectious disease, how many girls won't go to school, how many livelihoods programmes from women-headed households will be cut. And I wonder if we could do more to explain to people what the impact of UK aid cuts are going to be, notwithstanding, and I respect all of the efforts that you're doing to mitigate that. Because Noah asked you about the impact, I just wonder if you would be willing to sort of commit to giving a better impact assessment to people so that we can properly understand the impact of these cuts.
Well, an impact assessment, as I said, will be done, and so the committee will be able to scrutinise those areas in the months ahead. But I do want to push back slightly. It's economic growth that lifts people out of poverty. That's what lifts people out of poverty. That's what's lifted, I think it's just under 1 million people out of poverty in China. It's what's lifted people out of poverty in India. And actually, surely the journey is for countries to transition out of development aid. So that's the first thing.
It's also preventing people from getting into poverty in the first place.
But it's economic growth that delivers that. It's jobs that deliver that. That's what African leaders say they want to me. They want jobs for their community. And we are very committed still to humanitarian aid. We will still be a big humanitarian aid partner. We will still play a massive role in the multilateral system. I announced a decision on Gavi. We are hosting the Global Fund with South Africa. But I do want to say that it's economic growth that delivers for people. We haven't talked about the work of BII and private investment that also delivers opportunities for people and will continue over the months ahead. And I also stand by the fact that actually keeping people safe, defensively, and hard power delivers for people and keeps people alive. So there will be an equality impact assessment. Of course, I accept that we have stepped down, or we will be spending less money over the years ahead, but we've made a commitment to get back to higher spending. We will still be the 6th biggest global spender, and we do need to reform the system, and I've set out how I think we should do that, and Baroness Chapman's been before you and also set that out on a couple of occasions.
And just quickly on the actual cuts to the FCDO budget as well. The Foreign Affairs Committee was told that you're expected to reduce headcount by 15 to 25% in the next 4 years. How much do you forecast these redundancies are going to cost, and will they come from the FCDO budget allocation?
Well, we got a transformation fund of 216 million to help us change the department. We got a zero-based allocation at the spending review. Now, that is in the end about ensuring that we have the right capabilities over this next period. And I want capabilities around tech. I want better economic capability. We actually lost quite a lot of development capability, and that's why we advertised for 200 development experts to come into the department. We've got to have the right capabilities. And I did take the view that the department was quite top-heavy. We have a lot of Director Generals, we've got a lot of directors in the department, and I was concerned that there were good middle-ranking civil servants who, at the moment, are subject to a promotion freeze. And sometimes you've got to free up people at the top of the organisation who are paid a little bit more so that those in the middle can move up and be paid more, alongside the decisions that we're hoping to make about capability particularly. So that's what we're trying to achieve on the 2030 programme, and I'm confident we will achieve it. And it's informed also by the reviews that I asked to be undertook when I came into the job, to inform the sorts of capabilities that we need over this next period.
And talking about capabilities, what do you think the impact will be specifically on development expertise within the FCDO?
Well,
which of course has already taken a hit in the merger.
We're increasing development expertise. We've just advertised for 200 jobs to get in experts. They're coming into the department as we speak. So we're increasing development expertise that was lost under the last government and replacing it and bringing it into the department.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Reid.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Foreign Secretary, for being with us today. So, you had 14 years in opposition. You've been in post for a year now. What we've seen throughout the year is you reduced ODA spend from 0.5 down to 0.3. But I'm still not hearing any cohesive vision for where you want to go. Now, you said you'll go do a line-by-line scrutiny and that this will be coming out in the next couple of months, but I'm still not hearing it. What's been happening for the last year? I think to follow on from that, what we do know is that a significant chunk of that money that will be left will be going to the Home Office to be spent on asylum hotels. What view do you have of that being a car-side commitment? We've obviously heard the announcement from the government that it will be ending by the end of this Parliament. What process and what equity will you have with the Home Office to make sure that practice does stop?
Well, I've got to refute your first question in terms of what we've been doing over the last year. 15 million children this year have been immunised. We've just pledged 1.25 billion to Gavi. On women's and girls and on women's rights, over 100 countries have been channelling 56 million.
Foreign Secretary, look, we've been over all of those figures.
On climate and nature.
I've spoken to the Minister responsible as well,
people,
and there is no cohesive vision.
You gave the impression that nothing was happening this year in your question.
I'm not saying that, I'm saying there is no vision.
Well, I've set out the vision.
We haven't heard it.
Well,
I haven't heard it from the previous Minister either.
Well, I listened to Baroness Chapman, and I think she did give a strong vision. She said that we are moving from donor to investor. We will be investing in the technical skills that countries say that they want from us. For example, when I was with President Ruto a few weeks ago, he was thanking us for the work that we've done to encourage better trade between countries in Africa, and he thinks there's more that we can do. We are not departing from obligations on health and clearly bringing the leader on health.
Here's another problem. Can you
That's
understand?
a vision.
Can you understand how difficult that is to communicate to the UK public about how their taxpayers' money is being spent?
Well, you'll appreciate that sadly, when you look at public attitude to development, it has not been in a brilliant place. That's not under this government, that's under the last government.
This is the point I'm making, Foreign Secretary. You've had a year to come up with this vision. You had 14 years in opposition to come up with this vision. All we've seen is a reduction. And going to the question now around asylum hotels, a large chunk of what is left is going to the Home Office.
Well, you know that we inherited a situation that we did not support, where a lion's share of development spend was being spent in country. Since we've come to office, less money is being spent in country. My colleagues in the Home Office and led by Yvette Cooper have been able to reduce, I think, from 83% to 77%, am I right?
So we said that it's going to go down to 0% by 2029. So what's that process?
Can I finish the point, please,
Of course.
Mr. Reid? We have reduced the numbers in a year being spent on hotels that we inherited from the Tories. We've reduced the numbers, and we've got a deal from the Treasury that means that we now have stability in the development budget, and we will not be affected by decisions made in relation to hotels going forward. That's what's been achieved under this government, because the last government did not put it off.
So how's it going to happen? How, as the FCDO Secretary, how will you monitor that with the Home Office?
Well, the thing I'm principally concerned with is that my budget is stable and it's not affected by paying hotel bills in this country. I've pulled that off. It's also the case that the Home Secretary is absolutely committed to reducing the number of asylum seekers in hotels. She has brought down those numbers in the last year. She's got more to do. And as she does that, do you expect the Foreign Secretary to go back to the Treasury and ask for increased funds? Of course you do. And yes, I'll be knocking on the door, if that's the implication of your question.
Okay, so the follow-on from that then, so this will be split equity across the FCDO and the Home Office. People that do come here illegally, where will they go?
Sorry, following on from that.
So at the moment, if people come here illegally, they are put in hotels, and that's paid for through the ODA budget, which goes to the Home Office. If you're saying, and the government's saying, that that's going to be reduced down to 0 by the end of this Parliament, 2029, where do you envisage people that will come here illegally, where will they go?
That gets us into a much lengthier discussion that you should probably make to the Home Secretary, not to me.
But it's split equity across the FCDO.
It's not a split equity. I've just said we've now got stability.
Okay, I would disagree heavily with that.
That was the deal that I got in the spending review, because the last government did not strike that deal. I got that deal to give ODA spending stability, for us not to be at the mercy of asylum spend. I got that deal. But yes, it is the case that the Home Secretary now has to reduce the numbers. That's a big job, but she's done a great job in the last year.
But the people who come here illegally are coming from international countries. So how does the FCDO not have equity in that process?
Well, I've also, if you're asking about wider FCDO equities on migration, of course we play a big role on returns, and we are attempting to increase returns. Countries like Pakistan, returns have gone up in the last year. I announced earlier on this year migration sanctions. We'll be coming forward with that very, very shortly. There's work that we do upstream that's come up briefly. I see great work in Egypt, in Tunisia. When I talk about economic development and the work we can do so people are prepared to stay in country, that's an important role that our diplomats and development experts play in my department. So there's a lot that we contribute to this agenda to bring down the numbers. Yes.
Okay, and so final question on that. So the number will go down to 0% in asylum hotels, and the approach that you just laid out will make sure that no one comes here illegally anymore and that no one will be housed here. Is that your points? So purely on return deals and working upstream, that's going to be enough?
If I may, Mr. Reid, I think the implication of your question is a soundbite. I don't think
it is. This is a very serious issue.
I don't think the government's saying that there will be 0 people.
Okay, so where will the people go then?
That's not what I'm saying. But you know as well as I do that we have brought the numbers down in the last year. You know that the last government left a bloating bill that was rising. You know our commitments to deal with irregular migration. You know the responsibilities that my department has in relation to returns, in relation to work upstream. I announced migration sanctions and I've brought stability to the department. I think I've done a good job in the last year. There is more to do, and that will be led from the Home Office. And I'm sorry that you're feeling a bit raw about the last government's record.
No.
I would be if I were you as well.
Foreign Secretary,
Foreign
these are...
Secretary, if I can just reconfirm that our role is to scrutinise ODA, and I think we're drifting slightly off ODA. Any more
It's
questions?
a big ODA spend, so I think it's very fair to ask these questions.
And it's fair for me to be robust in reply.
Any more?
No.
Alice, and then one.
Application, I think we all recognise we were left with a pretty terrible legacy and the backlog in the hotel, so I do recognise the costs are coming down. One thing I haven't been quite clear on now that the FCDO has moved to the spender of last resort is if the numbers come down and the spend on asylum comes down faster than expected, does that money definitely come back to the ODA budget? Like, what's the agreement on that with the Home Office or Treasury?
It doesn't automatically come
Right.
back to us. The price for stability is that I accepted that it wouldn't automatically come back to us, but I have made it clear to the committee that I would be making the case for increased spend, and making the case for increased spend, particularly in relation to development. You have that as my commitment, and I think you would be, and I would hope that any future Foreign Secretary, that was their undertaking, and they sought to do that. And you heard from the Prime Minister when we made the change following increased defence spending, that we were absolutely clear that we were not departing on our commitments to development spend. We do want to see it rise as the fiscal circumstances allow, and so of course I will be making that case in future spending and fiscal occasions.
Monica?
Foreign Secretary, on what you've just said, the commitment, therefore, by the British government to ODA, overseas development spent overseas, in 27-28, as ICAI have pointed out, is 0.24%. So it's not 0.3%, it's 0.24. That's the projection.
I saw this yesterday and I just don't recognise those numbers. I think ICAI are having to make a call on how they see refugee numbers rising or falling. What I'm going on is that the Home Secretary has brought those numbers down in the last year. I recognise there's more to do, but I'm standing by my colleague and her commitment to reduce the amount of asylum seekers in hotels.
Monica, thank you. Brian?
Foreign Secretary, back to development, if I may. Tackling climate change has been named as one of the 3 priorities for UK ODA spending going forward. What will this mean in practice?
Well, I remain committed to the vision that I set out in my Q lecture last year. It was why I appointed 2 special representatives, Rachel Kite for climate and Ruth Davis for nature, the first time that that's been done. It's why we signed a guarantee to the Innovative Finance Facility for climate in Asia and the Asia Pacific particularly, to unlock 1.2 billion. It's why the PM announced a very ambitious NDC for 2035, an 81% reduction in emissions, because we do want to encourage other countries to do the same. We're excited about COP. I had a fantastic breakfast with Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, Steve Reed and Ed Miliband, with our finance leaders, because there's more that we need to do on climate finance. We've also set up the Clean Power Alliance, the partnership with countries across the world as they race to clean power. All of that remains ambitious. We are not diminishing our ambition on climate and on nature.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. On a related matter, in a letter from your predecessor to the IDC back in April 2023, it was stated that UK funding for WASH had dropped by 56% from a high of 206.5 million in 2018. Before the recent announcement of the reduction of aid spend to 0.3, WASH funding was said to be down by 85%. As perhaps one of the most cross-cutting of aid interventions affecting not just health, but women and girls, education, food security, and indeed climate change amelioration, and so much more. Where does the Foreign Secretary see UK aid support for WASH going in the future?
I can't comment on specific allocations because they're not yet determined. We're making the determinations for the next year very shortly, and that detail will be with the committee, I think, before we rise or around the time we rise next week. So I recognise the concerns, but I don't want to stray so far as I start giving specific undertakings for, I mean, other schemes have been mentioned, for example, WISH, that I understand why the committee is scrutinising, but I can't give that undertaking at this point.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, the last government made some very bold and indeed welcome commitments around climate finance. I think it was 11.6 billion. I didn't at the time understand where that money was coming from, but in your breakfast, were you able to persuade the Chancellor that using money to try and mitigate climate risks and empower countries to build their own resilience was a good investment?
Well, the ICF is hugely important. The 11.6 billion was an important commitment, and I want to do all we can to continue with that funding. We're obviously coming to the end of that cycle, but I'm satisfied that we will be continuing to be an important leader on climate, and particularly on climate finance, and that's why I was very pleased to be with the Chancellor on this issue, and I hope as we get to October also, and Washington DC, I hope I can play a bigger role alongside the Chancellor to absolutely play our part in relation to climate finance. Everybody is saying also, with changes that they're seeing in the United States, that the City of London is the place for climate finance. We recognise that, and therefore there's more that we can do.
And you spoke earlier about BII. Is encouraging BII to take an active role in, I don't know, blue bonds, green bonds, different forms of climate finance? Is that something that you're in discussion with them over?
It is something under consideration.
And one point, I actually got clarity. I couldn't understand why, and I'm a big fan of BII, even though they might not think that, why they got quite a considerable uplift when other areas were getting reductions or being cut. And you were talking about the shift from being a donor to an investor. So I'm assuming that, and you were talking about economic growth is the only way out of poverty. So I'm assuming that that's why they got the uplift. But BII tends to invest in middle income countries, and it tends to be the more stable countries that are able to take that sort of investment. Is there still a priority in your mind for the poorest of the poor, that we will be supporting them to get close to being in a position that they could take economic investment?
Well, actually, 60% of their portfolio is in Africa.
Yes, that's right.
I announced a 50 million Africa Resilience Investment Facility specifically for low-income countries at the G20 in South Africa back in February. And just two statistics that have stood out to me that have really affected me. Despite all that's been spent on development by the Global West, 50% of Africans still do not have access to electricity.
Exactly.
And so you've got to ask, could we have done more in the past in relation to finance and energy? And I think the answer is yes, as a Western community, to alleviate that. And certainly should we be doing more in the future to bring that down. And it's still the case that only 3% of climate finance is available to African economies. So that's why I also say, and the committee has pressed this morning, as I understand it's your right to do, and I would if I was sitting on the committee. But, let's be clear that if 50% of Africans have not got access to even electricity, for all that we're attempting to do in education, for all that we're attempting to do for women and girls, how does that affect women and girls? Profoundly. There is more to do, and that is why when African leaders say, no, what we want from you is economic growth, please. What we want you is to support us with jobs. What we want you to do is do UK, thank you for what you're doing on trade in Africa, but could you do more? I get it. I absolutely get it, because the answer must be that we could do more, which is the new model that we're moving to. When Mr. Reid asks about vision, that is the vision. Technical skills, better support on energy, better support on climate and climate finance. That is what the continent say they want. Economic growth, the same that we want for our own constituents.
You'll be very keen to read our forthcoming report on community energy. And we have been really impressed with some of the micro businesses that have benefited from having their own source of energy. But one of the comments that we keep on getting is BII, other development institutes, the scale of their investment is to such a point that it rules out a lot of those little sort of start-up businesses and locations and areas where really we're talking tiny financial investment to enable them to sort of get their egg business off the ground. So if I can urge you to also be looking at the poorest of the poor and the initiatives that we can be doing, whether that's bilateral or encouraging the multilaterals to do more. It seems, whilst difficult to find the investments for BII that are ready and that meet their terms, there are many, many tiny ones that are not even getting a look in on that stage. So anything you can do, Foreign Secretary, I'd be hugely grateful
That's
for.
why this new African Resilience Investment Facility is so important. It's a 50 million fund, so it's specifically for those micro businesses that has been established. They're doing great work in South Africa, but I think that I do recognise, and the committee will recognise, that we should be very concerned, despite countries travelling out of ODA recipient status and becoming middle-income countries or less developed countries, there are a group of countries, particularly in the Horn of Africa, countries like Chad, like Sudan, countries in the Sahel like Niger, that are subject to the worst of the climate catastrophe, that are subject to the worst of conflict and malign agents, Wagner forces and others, playing a role in their country, so really affecting governance. So there are a group of countries that are incredibly fragile, that will require good coordinated response. Some of that must come from multilaterals, and I've been pressing multilaterals to do more, particularly in conflict zones. But some of it will have to come from bilateral aid with partners working together. And I do recognise that in this period where countries are reducing development spend, particularly for that group of countries in the Horn of Africa, we have to be vigilant.
And if I could ask you to put that focus on groups of individuals, and I'm thinking hard to reach areas geographically. I'm thinking, again, I'm going to say this, women and girls, but also people in marginalised groups, people with disabilities. It's my concern, and I believe this committee's concern, whenever mainstreaming happens, that 95% might get access, but it's that 5% that don't have a voice that really need our support and your attention, Foreign Secretary. Can I bring Alice in, please?
Yes, just talking about Africa and financing. Obviously, we just had the Financing for Development conference in Seville. Debt was high on the agenda. It's one of the biggest things holding back particularly African countries, in terms of how much they have to spend servicing their debt instead of investing in healthcare. We spoke earlier this week about the role the City of London could play, particularly. UK law governs 90% of the debt within the common framework, I believe. So could you just talk a bit about what we are doing to champion debt relief, debt restructuring for the countries that need it most?
The debt issue obviously is more complex than it was when the global community came together on debt relief when I was last in government, in part because a lot of debt is now owed to China. But you're right, it's still the case that debt remains an issue, particularly, and that is an issue that African leaders also raise with us, and that the servicing costs particularly are high. There is work that we need to do with the rating agencies that comes up time and time again, and UK leadership is required there. A fortnight ago, as you said, in Seville, we welcomed the package of reforms on debt, specifically strong action to improve the voice of the debtors particularly, and debt transparency, disaster pause clauses particularly, pioneering innovations like the innovation that we've made around insurance can play a role. We did that for Caribbean countries. We saw that after Hurricane Beryl in Grenada particularly. How we put debtor countries across the global financial system. The chair had a suggestion for SIDS particularly. So that's activity. This is a work in progress. We are not there yet, and there are differences. I think there are differences across nations, particularly global north nations, on how to approach the debt issue.
I'm hearing it's on your radar, Foreign Secretary. James.
I'm conscious of time. So, Foreign Secretary, I think you spoke to the equivalent committee in the Lords in May. You referenced hosting, or the potential of hosting, a global conference around foreign aid and the future approach to that. Can you confirm that we are committed to doing that?
Yes.
Fantastic. And the objectives of the conference, you clear at the moment the objectives of that conference?
Well, I want to convene on the issue of coordination with other countries, obviously with parts of the global south, and obviously with some of the NGO community. It's really a future development conference in what has been a very turbulent year for development. We do need some innovation. We should be coordinated in our approach. We do need to hear this voice that we have heard through our Africa approach, but not all other nations have undertaken that sort of exercise. So we've got to bring that voice to the table. In a way, I would have liked the conference to be tomorrow, but in truth, I'm conscious that we've got UNGA, we've got COP. It's a busy autumn period, so it may be that this is towards the end of the year, the beginning of next year, to allow the space, but also to give colleagues the time really to think through the innovations that they want to see, and to recognise, with the closure of USAID particularly, and with the UN reform programme and the work that Tom Fletcher's doing on the humanitarian aid piece, there is a lot of work that's happening, but we should let that work complete, come together and really refresh our global development offer. That's why I want that conference, and it should be held here in London, because we have always led on these issues.
Foreign Secretary, we're excited to hear that, and the committee's keen to help any way that we can. A few final questions from Monica. We're turning across the pond, and over to you.
Ms. Harding.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. What has concerned you most about the very significant cut in US development spend?
Well, I did raise this with Marco Rubio. He was at pains to emphasise to me that that they would be looking at these issues through US national interests. He was at pains to emphasise to me most recently the work that they've done with Rwanda and DRC, for example, Yesterday, I was speaking to colleagues in the US about my concerns about extremism in parts of the Horn of Africa. This has been very disruptive to the global aid community. That's a concern. But I am pleased that the United States is examining how it can continue to play a role, particularly in the continent of Africa.
So, Foreign Secretary, the cuts are huge, and as you say, will disrupt the provision of aid. And given that you are at pains to point out that your position or the cuts to UK aid are not ideological, are you doing anything to persuade the US to change course on, for example, the end of funding for WHO, for Gavi? They've rejected the US the Sustainable Development Goals. They've reinstated the Mexico City policy, etc. What conversations have you had about that?
My emphasis has been coordinating with partners to meet the need that we see. We will not be able, even as partners, to meet all of the need that we see. I have also, of course, made representations about my concern that other autocracies or countries that are keen to break up the rules-based order might move into some of the gaps. So of course I've made those representations, but I am confident when you see the US in areas like Somalia, as I said, the DRC, Rwanda, playing a role, that we will see funds coming back into the system, but they will be coming back in a different way.
And can I reference what you've just said to other actors moving into the space? And you referenced this in your Locale speech. Are you worried about the impact of USA ID cuts and UK aid cuts in the threat from Russia and China moving into the spaces that we vacate?
Well, to be fair, China's Belt and Road Initiative started a long time before decisions made on USID. That's been a journey that's been happening for most of my political career, to be fair. And look, of course there's always going to be a role for superpowers in relation to supporting the poorest wherever they are. But there was a consensus after the Second World War that countries that largely make up the G7, European partners, did have an important role to play, not solely actually, this was a self-interested role, because often these problems find their way to our own countries. So there's self-interest here. The Americans have said that they're acting in their national interest, so they too concede that there must be some self-interest in ensuring, for example, the outbreak of pandemic affects us all. Climate affects us all. Conflict often comes back to the doors of countries who've heavily invested in defence. All of this requires action.
Foreign Secretary, you have been in post for a little over a year. It has been a remarkable year on the global stage. I am incredibly grateful that you have steered it to the best of your ability, and can I also recognise from the committee's perspective the team that you have around you are remarkable, and we have always received fantastic both welcome information, evidence from them, and I'm really grateful that you have allowed that to happen, and thank you so much for your time today. You have also been incredibly generous with your time, your experience, your views and opinions. Even if we might disagree on some of them, we're very, very grateful that you made the time to have that scrutiny. And order, this session is